Welcome to the Philosophical Odysseys podcast. Today we are embarking on a journey that is going to take us to the very edge of modern thought.
Absolutely. It's a big one today.
It really is. We are unpacking a text that fundamentally changed how I view, well, reality, history, and the systems we live in every single day.
Yeah, it completely rewires your brain.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore a profound, challenging, and just endlessly rewarding source text, Allan Megill's Prophets of Extremity, or, as it's known in the Turkish translation we're working from today, Aşırılığın Peygamberleri.
Which is a fantastic translation, by the way.
It is. Now, if you are listening to this, you're already the kind of person who doesn't shy away from complex ideas. You know the territory.
Right, you're not afraid of the deep end.
Exactly. But I want to promise you up front, we are not going to get bogged down in impenetrable academic jargon today.
No, definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
We're translating these towering concepts into tangible, mind-bending aha moments.
Because we want to tease out a premise that feels incredibly urgent for the world we live in right now. I mean, what actually happens to a society when its foundational beliefs?
Right, absolute bedrock.
Yeah, the bedrock. Things like logic, linear history, and Enlightenment progress. What happens when all of that just completely collapses?
That is, that's the pivotal question of the modern era, isn't it?
It has to be.
And to answer it, our source material introduces us to four distinct, monumental prophets who attempted to navigate this profound collapse.
And we know the names: Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida.
Right. But what Megill does that is so unique, and what we really need to focus on today, is that he doesn't examine these four figures as traditional philosophers.
He doesn't just treat them as, men sitting in armchairs trying to discover a literal, objective truth about the universe.
Exactly. Instead, he looks at them through two specific, highly interconnected lenses: the lens of aestheticism and the lens of a post-historicist crisis.
Crisis and aestheticism.
Yes. And by viewing their work through these two pillars, we can begin to chart exactly how the modern world arrived at such a fragmented, subjective, and intensely skeptical view of truth and reality.
Okay, let's unpack this, because those two pillars, crisis and aestheticism, are the absolute foundation for everything we are going to discuss in this deep dive.
They set the stage for all four thinkers.
So let's start with the first one, crisis. I was genuinely fascinated by Megill's redefinition of this word.
It's totally counterintuitive, right?
It is, because when you and I hear the word crisis in our daily lives, we usually think of an acute emergency.
A natural disaster.
Right, or a sudden financial crash, or maybe a personal psychological breakdown. But Megill's concept of a cultural or historical crisis is fundamentally different, isn't it?
It is entirely different, and we really have to separate it from the way the 19th century usually talked about crisis.
How so?
Well, to understand Megill's specific definition, we have to contrast it with the more traditional theological idea of a crisis.
Okay, theological.
Yeah. In 19th century European thought, the overarching crisis was almost always viewed as the loss of God.
The existential abyss.
Exactly.
Okay.
It was the abyss that suddenly opens up when divine authority and the absolute moral standards that come with it just vanish from the public square.
But Megill is arguing that the true crisis these four specific prophets are responding to is not primarily theological.
No, it's historical.
Historical.
Specifically, he pinpoints a very specific window of time, roughly the period around 1880 to 1920.
Right, so the turn of the 20th century, industrialization is peaking, World War I completely shatters Europe.
Exactly. And during this specific window, the widespread, almost religious belief in a linear, rational, continuously progressing history completely fractured.
Because you have to remember, for centuries, heavily influenced by the Enlightenment and thinkers like G.W.F. Hegel.
Western society believed history was a straight line.
Like a conveyor belt moving inevitably toward a rational, perfected endpoint.
Yes, and the crisis Megill identifies is the sudden, terrifying realization that this line was a complete fiction.
I want to make sure we really grasp the weight of this for a second. It's like society woke up and realized the train tracks they thought they were traveling on didn't actually lead to a shimmering city on a hill.
No, they didn't.
They just stopped abruptly in the middle of a barren wasteland. All that momentum, all that suffering and progress was just for nothing.
That is a great visual. But let's actually push that train track analogy even further to capture Megill's brilliance here.
Okay, let's do it.
Megill points out a fascinating paradox. Historicism, which is that deeply held belief in a linear, progressive timeline, is actually a strict prerequisite for this specific crisis.
Oh, wow. Right.
You cannot have a fracture unless you first have a solid line to break.
That makes so much sense. You can't mourn a destination you never thought you were going to reach in the first place?
Precisely. For a society that never believed in linear progress, say, a society that views time as cyclical, like the changing of the seasons, there is no historical crisis when things go wrong.
It's just winter coming again.
Exactly. But because 19th century Europeans have been deeply conditioned to see time as a meaningful progression, the sudden loss of that belief was devastating.
It made the present moment feel entirely directionless.
Directionless, disconnected, and completely void of value. The present was no longer a meaningful stepping stone to a utopian future. It was just a void.
You are stranded on the tracks, and the train isn't coming.
And that perfectly sets up the second pillar.
Right, because if the historical timeline is completely shattered, and you are left floating in this terrifying void of meaning, what on earth do you do?
How do you survive that?
Exactly. And this brings us to aestheticism. Now, I want to clarify this for you listening because this tripped me up at first.
It's a very specific use of the word.
Yeah. When we say aestheticism in the context of Megill's book, we absolutely do not mean art for art's sake.
No, we aren't talking about wealthy aristocrats sipping wine in a gallery debating the brushstrokes on a canvas.
We are talking about something much, much more radical.
That is a crucial distinction to make. If we limit aesthetics to just fine art, we miss the entire point of these four thinkers.
So how does he define it?
In this context, aestheticism is the radical, almost aggressive expansion of the aesthetic realm to cover all of reality.
All of reality.
Think about what we just established with the crisis. The objective historical world is broken. There is no inherent meaning to be found.
The universe is silent.
Therefore, human beings must construct their own reality. They must create meaning the exact same way a novelist constructs a narrative or a painter constructs a landscape.
So there is no pre-existing objective truth out there waiting to be discovered by a scientist.
No. There is only a reality waiting to be aesthetically invented by an artist.
So to synthesize this and put it plainly for you listening, the crisis is the void of meaning. It is the blank canvas. And that void acts as the absolute precondition for aestheticism, which is the act of creating meaning ex nihilo, out of nothing.
Because the universe provides us with no script, no stage directions, and no inherent purpose.
So we are forced to become the authors, the playwrights, and the set designers of our own existence.
That is exactly the dynamic. The crisis clears the ground, and aestheticism builds the new house.
And the thinker who initiates this monumental shift, the foundational aesthete of this entire philosophical movement, is Friedrich Nietzsche.
Let's dive deep into Nietzsche then.
Most people have a surface-level familiarity with him. They know him for the provocative phrase, God is dead.
Or they view him as a gloomy nihilist.
Right, or perhaps a naturalist philosopher focused on biology and power. But Megill insists that we have to view him primarily through this lens of the aesthete.
It's the only way to really understand his project.
So how does his specific reaction to the death of God lead directly to this grand aesthetic worldview?
Well, let's look at what the death of God actually entails for Nietzsche. It is not just a statement about atheism.
What is it then?
It is a declaration about the collapse of all absolute transcendent guarantees of truth.
The safety nets are gone.
Exactly. Once you remove God, or the Enlightenment secular equivalent, which is absolute reason, Nietzsche sees a world that is radically groundless.
There's no heaven above to judge us.
And as we established with the historical crisis, there is no rational utopian endpoint ahead of us to strive for.
Just the void.
In response to this terrifying, vertigo-inducing freedom, Nietzsche introduces a concept that is, frankly, mind-bending. He suggests that the world itself and human existence within it should be understood and justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon.
He views the universe as a self-generating work of art.
Yes.
I really want to linger on that because it is such a wild departure from how we are taught to see the world.
It changes everything.
It's like looking at the universe not as a giant clockwork machine governed by strict physical laws, which is the scientific view,
Right.
but instead viewing it as an ever-evolving, chaotic, improvisational jazz performance.
Yes. And the jazz analogy is particularly apt because it brings us to one of the most fascinating and foundational dynamics in Nietzsche's early masterpiece, The Birth of Tragedy.
Oh, this is such a good part of the book.
To understand how Nietzsche views this self-generating artwork of a world, we have to understand the clash between two Greek deities, Apollo and Dionysus.
Right, and these aren't just characters in a myth for Nietzsche, they are fundamental forces of reality, so let's break them down.
Okay, so Apollo is the god of light, visual boundaries, measure, proportion, and form.
The structured stuff.
Exactly. When you think of the Apollonian force, think of structure, individuality, clarity, and the beautiful illusions that make life bearable. It is the force of the sculptor shaping marble.
And Dionysus is the exact opposite.
On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, Dionysus is the god of darkness, music, intoxication, and the frenzied, violent breaking down of all individual boundaries.
The Dionysian force is chaotic, non-visual, communal, and terrifyingly raw.
To put that into a modern context, if you are sitting at your desk looking at a perfectly organized spreadsheet where every cell is defined and separate.
That is deeply Apollonian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you were in the middle of a mosh pit at a heavy metal concert,
Or completely lost in a hypnotic techno beat in a dark club where you forget where your body ends and the crowd begins.
then you are tapping into the Dionysian.
That is a perfect translation of the concepts.
Now, what's crucial for our deep dive is that this is not a rational, logical debate between two scientific theories.
It's a non-rational aesthetic polarity.
Yes. Nietzsche argues that the greatest achievement of the ancient Greeks, their tragic theater, was born only from the delicate, tension-filled union of these two warring forces.
The chaotic, terrifying truth of Dionysus was made bearable by being presented through the beautiful, structured forms of Apollo.
Exactly. But more importantly, for Megill's thesis, this specific clash sets the stage for how all these prophets view reality.
The Apollonian represents the constructed illusions of order we absolutely need to survive.
While the Dionysian represents the terrifying, chaotic, boundaryless truth of existence underneath.
And this brings up a really critical point. If the underlying fundamental reality of the universe is this chaotic Dionysian swirl, this dark, intoxicating music,
then any attempt to define it logically, neatly, and permanently is bound to fail.
and this leads directly into Nietzsche's attack on traditional logic and his incredibly radical view on what truth actually is.
Indeed. Nietzsche launches a devastating, uncompromising critique against the Enlightenment's worship of pure reason.
Because thinkers like Kant and Descartes believed reason was the ultimate tool to dissect reality.
But Nietzsche argues that logic, concepts, and rigid scientific categories are nothing more than what he calls pale, cold, gray nets.
Gray nets.
We throw these gray nets over the vibrant, terrifying, ever-shifting chaos of the senses simply to make it manageable.
Therefore, what we arrogantly call truth is not an objective reflection of reality at all.
Not even close.
So if it's not a reflection of reality, what is it?
It is merely a necessary, life-affirming illusion. It is a creative falsification. We lie to ourselves about the stability of the world so that we can function within it.
Think about that for a second, you listening, because it really challenges how we go about our day. How often do you mistake the symbols of your world for the world itself?
We do it constantly.
We look at a map on our phone and we think we understand the physical territory. We look at a clock ticking on the wall and we think we understand the immense mystery of time.
We use language to categorize a tree, completely ignoring the unique, chaotic biological reality of that specific organism.
Nietzsche is telling us that these concepts, the map, the clock, the word, they are just a gray net.
The truth of our daily lives is a fictional story we tell ourselves. Because if we were exposed to the raw, unfiltered Dionysian reality for even a second, it would simply crush us.
And this is where the aestheticism reaches its peak in Nietzsche. Because truth is inherently an illusion, the person who constructs the best, most powerful, most life-affirming illusion is not the scientist in the laboratory.
It is the artist, hence aestheticism. The scientist is just an artist who forgot they're making things up.
Nietzsche actively calls for the creation of new, powerful myths to replace the broken historical ones. He wants us to be conscious artists of our own lives.
So Nietzsche leaves us with a mandate to be fiercely active. We are tasked to creatively forge our own myths, to wield our will to power in the face of the crisis.
But as we move chronologically to our next prophet, Martin Heidegger, we see a radically different approach to this exact same historical crisis.
A completely opposite approach in many ways.
Now, to set the stage for Heidegger, we have to talk about a massive shift in his own thinking.
Right.
He is famous for his early work, particularly his dense, towering masterpiece, Being and Time. In that book, he was heavily focused on human existence, on what he called Dasein, which translates roughly to being in the world.
He was very focused on subjective human experience, anxiety, and our relationship to our own death.
But as he gets older, his writings undergo a drastic transformation. They become incredibly mysterious, poetic, and focused on something quite different.
Yes, that shift is so famous in philosophy that it has its own term, the care. or the turn.
The turn.
While Nietzsche responded to the crisis of meaning with an active, almost joyful call to create new myths, the later Heidegger is defined by a deep, profound, and sometimes melancholic nostalgia.
Nostalgia for what?
Well, Heidegger looks at the modern age, the age of rampant global technology, mass industrial mechanization, and the total dominance of the scientific worldview. And he doesn't see progress.
What does he see?
He sees it as the absolute dead-end completion of metaphysics. To him, this completion is synonymous with total nihilism.
Why does he equate technology and science with nihilism? I mean, that seems counterintuitive to a modern listener who views a smartphone or medical advancements as a net positive.
Because he believes that humanity has suffered a catastrophic forgetting of being. And by being with a capital B, he means the profound, mysterious event of existence itself.
That anything exists at all.
Exactly. We are so utterly obsessed with manipulating beings, lowercase b, meaning objects, natural resources, data, and even other humans, that we have completely lost touch with the awe-inspiring mystery of being itself.
We treat the entire planet as a giant gas station, a standing reserve of resources to be optimized.
That's his exact critique of technology.
Okay, let's contrast our two thinkers so far. If Nietzsche is the frantic artist furiously painting a new, vibrant canvas over the void,
Heidegger is standing in an empty, quiet field, deeply mourning a lost, ancient connection to the earth.
he is mourning this forgetting of being. But art still plays a massive central role for Heidegger, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
It just functions entirely differently than it does for Nietzsche. For Heidegger, art isn't just a subjective human coping mechanism.
Far from it. And this is where we really need to unpack Heidegger's attack on the traditional way we view the world, specifically the Cartesian and Kantian traditions.
Hold on, before we go further into how Heidegger views art, let's make sure we are completely grounded here. When you say Cartesian tradition, you're talking about René Descartes, right?
Yes.
The classic, I think, therefore I am, philosophy. Can you, ELI5, explain like I'm 5, what exactly Heidegger is attacking there?
Certainly. Descartes created a massive foundational wall between the human mind and the physical world.
Okay, a wall.
In the Cartesian view, there is the subject, which is you, your conscious mind, sitting safely inside your skull.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is the object.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else in the universe, which is essentially just dumb, dead matter waiting to be observed or manipulated by you.
Right, I'm the subject, the microphone is the object.
Exactly. Kant later formalized how this subject views the object. And this split defines modern science and modern aesthetics. When you go to a museum, you, the subject, stand apart from the painting, the object, and have a subjective feeling about it.
You are separate from it, you judge it.
Exactly. Heidegger violently rejects this separation. For the later Heidegger, great art is not a subjective human experience. It is not something you just look at and feel nice about.
What is it then?
Art is ontological. Ontology is the study of being. Heidegger claims that a true artwork doesn't just represent the world like a photograph. The artwork actively opens up and sustains a world.
It creates a space.
It is the place where being itself steps out of the shadows and reveals itself to us.
It's almost like the artwork is a portal rather than a picture.
That's a great way to put it.
There is a really famous, almost legendary anecdote from Megill's source material that perfectly illustrates this complex idea, and it involves a painting by Vincent van Gogh of a pair of old, worn peasant shoes.
Oh, this is a classic debate.
Can you walk us through that specific debate? Because it perfectly encapsulates Heidegger's entire philosophy and its flaws.
It is a brilliant illustrative example. Heidegger wrote a deeply influential essay called The Origin of the Work of Art, where he spends a significant amount of time analyzing this specific Van Gogh painting.
Just a painting of some dirty shoes.
Yes. But looking at these beat-up shoes on the canvas, Heidegger claims that through the magic of the artwork, the shoes reveal the entire profound world of the peasant woman who theoretically wore them.
He projects a whole narrative onto them.
He writes this incredibly poetic, romanticized passage about how the shoes show her heavy tread through the muddy furrows of the field, her anxiety over impending childbirth, her shivering at the approach of winter, and her deep, silent connection to the earth.
So the artwork, in Heidegger's view, isn't just paint on canvas. It actively brings the truth of this peasant world into the light of being.
Exactly. It opens the portal to her world.
It's a beautiful piece of writing, but there's a massive historical catch, isn't there?
Yes, a rather embarrassing one. Years later, the renowned art historian Meyer Shapiro reads Heidegger's essay and pushes back hard with historical facts.
What does Shapiro say?
Shapiro points out that the shoes in the painting almost certainly did not belong to a rural peasant woman. They belonged to Van Gogh himself. They were the shoes of a city-dwelling, modern artist walking on urban cobblestones. Heidegger essentially hallucinated this entire romantic agrarian fantasy onto a painting of some guy's sneakers.
Which is incredibly embarrassing for a philosopher claiming to reveal the ultimate truth of being. But the story doesn't end there because our fourth prophet, Derrida, eventually enters the chat, right?
Exactly. Jacques Derrida steps in and completely deconstructs both of them.
What's his take?
He points out that both Heidegger and Shapiro are entirely missing the point, because they are both projecting their own intense desires for ownership and origin onto the painting.
Heidegger desperately wants the shoes to belong to the earth and the peasant to justify his philosophy of nostalgia.
And Shapiro wants them to belong to the urban artist to justify his modern, historical view of art.
But Derrida shows that the painting itself resists both of these neat categorizations. The truth of the shoes is ultimately unpin-downable. I love that story because it perfectly exposes Heidegger's romantic, deeply nostalgic, and frankly somewhat forced connection to this mystical concept of the earth and the peasantry.
He wanted so desperately to find an ontological grounding in a lost rural past to counter the alienation of modern technology.
Yes, and this deep nostalgia leads directly to his ultimate defining stance regarding the historical crisis, which is a stance of extreme passivity. He uses a German term, Gelassenheit, which translates roughly to releasement or passive waiting.
Right. Contrast that for a moment with Nietzsche.
Okay, if I'm feeling the anxiety of the crisis, Nietzsche tells me to grab a hammer and chisel and sculpt my own reality. What does Heidegger tell me to do?
Heidegger tells you to put the hammer down and sit quietly.
Just wait.
He believed that in the face of the all-consuming destructive essence of modern technology, which he saw as an unstoppable epical destiny, human action is completely futile.
You cannot engineer your way out of the crisis of technology by using more technology.
Exactly. In a very famous interview published after his death, he stated quite plainly, "Only a God can save us now.
Only a God.
All we can do as human beings is practice Gelassenheit. We must passively wait, listen to poetry, and prepare our minds for a new, unforeseeable revelation of being."
Now, at this point in the deep dive, we need to address a critical historical reality regarding Heidegger. While he was philosophically preaching this quiet, passive waiting and totally rejecting the linear progression of human history, this highly abstract framework completely erased the actual lived historical realities of millions of individual people.
It absolutely did.
And we must impartially note, based strictly on the historical account in Megill's source material, that this philosophical passivity, combined with his romanticization of the rural German folk and the earth, tied directly into his highly controversial, deeply problematic political alignments in Germany during the 1930s.
Yes, this is a very well-documented connection in the text.
We are not here to preach, litigate his soul, or endorse any viewpoints. But the source makes it unequivocally clear that when a thinker views history not as a tangible record of individual human lives and suffering, but as a grand, abstract history of being, it can lead to a very dangerous, catastrophic detachment from real-world ethical consequences.
That is an essential piece of context provided by Megill. Heidegger's overarching aesthetic and ontological framework, his obsession with the grand destiny of being, often completely subsumed and blinded him to the concrete ethical realities of human individuals right in front of him.
Okay, so Heidegger reaches this dead end of passive waiting and abstract destiny. But as we move forward in time, a younger generation of thinkers looked at this passivity and rejected it entirely.
They certainly did.
So let's philosophically and geographically transition. We are moving from the quiet, rustic cabins of the German Black Forest to the bustling, hyper-intellectual cafes of post-WWII Paris. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Enter Michel Foucault.
We meet Michel Foucault. Foucault looked at the exact same broken world, the exact same crisis of meaning, but decided that waiting for a God to save us was essentially a surrender.
Yes. Now, at first glance, Foucault seems totally different from the poetic, romantic figures of Nietzsche and Heidegger.
Right, he wears a sharp turtleneck, he is bald, he looks and writes like a strict historian or a rigorous clinical social scientist digging through dusty archives. But is he really a scientist?
The short answer is absolutely not, though he expertly, almost playfully, plays the part of one.
So what is he doing?
To understand Foucault's unique brand of aestheticism, we have to look at his complex relationship with structuralism, which was the absolute dominant intellectual trend in Paris at the time.
Can we break down structuralism quickly for you listening?
Certainly, think of scientific structuralists, like the psychologist Jean Piaget or the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. They believe that if you look hard enough, you could find objective, universal, underlying laws or structures that governed all human behavior, language, and society.
It was a very scientific Apollonian quest for ultimate order.
Exactly. But Foucault was emphatically not that kind of structuralist. Megill argues he engaged in what we might call a structuralism of the sign.
A structuralism of sound.
It was a deeply anti-metaphysical, ironic approach. He used the rigorous, dry, scientific language of structure to map out human history, but he entirely rejected the idea that these structures represented an objective, hidden truth about human nature.
But wait, if Foucault doesn't believe there is a hidden truth about human nature to discover, what is he actually looking for in all those archives?
He is looking strictly at the surface.
Just the surface.
This is a massive revolutionary departure from the heavyweights of the 19th and early 20th centuries, like Karl Marx or Sigmund Freud.
Right, because both Marx and Freud are obsessed with depth.
Exactly. Marx believed that beneath the polite surface of society, there were hidden, undeniable economic truths and class struggles driving everything.
And Freud believed that beneath the surface of the conscious mind, there were hidden, repressed psychological truths driving all behavior.
But for Foucault, there is no depth. The idea of hidden truth is an illusion. Everything is entirely on the surface. Everything is what he calls discourse.
And this leads to perhaps his most famous concept, the episteme. Let's spend some time here, because grasping this is a massive aha moment.
An episteme is essentially a historical structure of knowledge. It is the unconscious set of rules in a given historical era that dictate what is even possible to think, say, or consider true.
It is the grid through which a society perceives reality.
Yes, and importantly, and this ties directly back to our first pillar, the collapse of linear history, these epistemes do not evolve linearly or progressively.
They don't slowly improve over time.
No. They suddenly appear, dominate reality for a few centuries, and then inexplicably violently disappear, replaced by a completely different set of rules.
I like to visualize this like society is playing a board game. For 300 years, the episteme is chess. The rules of chess define our entire reality. A knight moves in an L shape. That is the absolute truth.
Right.
Then suddenly, for no logical or progressive reason, the board flips and we are playing Monopoly. There is no logical progression from chess to Monopoly. The underlying rules of what constitutes reality just arbitrarily changed. A knight doesn't make sense in Monopoly.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And Megill shows how Foucault applies this aesthetic, almost theatrical lens to history in his brilliant early work, History of Madness.
Yes, let's explore that, because it perfectly illustrates the shift from chess to Monopoly. Foucault doesn't look at madness the way a modern doctor does, right?
Not at all. A modern doctor looks at the history of madness as a steady, linear progression of science, gradually learning to cure an objective medical condition.
Which makes sense to us.
But Foucault rejects that linear narrative. Instead, he views madness through a distinctly aesthetic Nietzschean lens.
He goes back to the Renaissance.
He looks back at the Renaissance, the era of the ship of fools, where the madman was allowed to wander freely, seen as possessing a strange, dark Dionysian wisdom. Madness was integrated into the chaotic fabric of society.
But then the episteme shifts. The board flips to the classical age.
Exactly. The Great Confinement begins. Society suddenly decides that madness is not a dark wisdom, but an error of unreason. The mad are physically locked away in massive asylums out of sight.
And then the board flips again to the modern era, the era of the psychiatric clinic.
And this is where Foucault really twists the knife. He argues that the modern clinical language of psychiatry doesn't actually cure madness, it merely captures it.
It captures it.
It takes this dark, boundary-breaking Dionysian energy, the kind of terrifying energy expressed in the art of figures like Antonin Artaud or the dark paintings of Francisco Goya, and it shines a harsh, Apollonian clinical light on it.
It cages the madness within the dry discourse of medical charts and diagnoses. That is such a profound and unsettling idea. The doctor's chart isn't a record of healing, it's a linguistic cage. It's an aesthetic choice society made to control the Dionysian chaos.
Yes, but Foucault didn't stay purely in this realm of analyzing historical discourse. As he moved into the 1970s with his massively influential works like Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality, his obsession shifted slightly but significantly.
It shifted from a focus purely on discourse to a relentless obsession with power.
And here we see a direct, undeniable link back to Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. Foucault begins to argue that discourse and knowledge are never, ever neutral. They are always inextricably linked to power.
He famously coined the term power/knowledge.
Yes, power doesn't just oppress people by saying no. Power is productive. It produces reality. It produces the very concept of truth.
This is where I want to push back a bit, or at least play devil's advocate for the listener. If Foucault is saying that every system of truth, every scientific advancement, every institution is just an arbitrary discourse, masking an underlying game of power, isn't his own theory just another arbitrary game of power?
Why should we listen to him over the psychiatrist?
Exactly.
That is the exact paradox his critics point out, and it's an incredibly valid critique. Foucault's response, essentially, is that he isn't offering a truer truth. He is offering a tactical tool for resistance.
So for you listening, think about the incredible contrast here between Foucault and Heidegger.
The contrast is massive.
Heidegger looked at the crisis of the modern world, the overwhelming systems of technology, and said, we must passively wait. Only a God can save us.
Foucault looks at the exact same crisis.
Right.
The realization that our institutions, our prisons, our hospitals, our sexual norms are just arbitrary discourses of power. And he goes in the exact opposite direction.
Where Heidegger waited in the woods, Foucault embraced an absolute furious political activism in the streets.
Yes, he advocated for constant, localized guerrilla warfare against the system, a perpetual revolution against whatever discourse happens to hold power at the moment.
But again, if every system of truth is just a mask for power and there is no ultimate utopian liberation at the end of the rainbow, what is the actual goal of Foucault's activism?
The goal isn't to reach a utopia. The goal is simply the act of resistance itself.
Resistance as an end in itself.
It is a relentless aesthetic performance of rebellion against the constraints of the present episteme. For Foucault, to resist the current system of power is the ultimate way to aesthetically construct yourself as a free human being, even if you know a new system of power will inevitably replace the old one.
Which is an exhausting, yet undeniably thrilling way to view the world. You're always pushing against the walls of the cage.
Oh, yeah.
But just when we think we have a handle on this aesthetic rebellion, just when we think we understand how to navigate the crisis by either creating myths, waiting for being, or resisting power, along comes our fourth and final prophet to pull the rug out from under absolutely everyone.
The final boss.
Let's introduce Jacques Derrida. If Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Foucault all built these grand, complex aesthetic visions to replace the broken linear history, what does Derrida do?
Derrida is the ultimate disruptor of this entire lineage. He is the anti-visionary.
He doesn't build a new myth.
He doesn't build a new aesthetic myth to live by. Instead, he meticulously deconstructs both the concept of aestheticism and the foundational concept of the crisis itself.
How does he do that?
Through a method of incredibly close, punishingly detailed critical reading, Derrida exposes the fact that Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Foucault, despite all their radical revolutionary posturing, we're still secretly relying on the very Enlightenment structures they loudly claim to have escaped.
Wow.
He calls them out.
Specifically, he shows they are all still deeply indebted to the ghosts of Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel.
Okay, let's slow down and break down how he attacks Kant first, because this is a masterclass in philosophical dismantling. Kant is famous for his work on aesthetics, specifically in how he separates what is art from what is not art. Yes. In Kant's monumental critique of judgment, he posits that there is a distinct, definable aesthetic realm, and it is completely separate from practical reality, morality, or scientific truth.
And this strict separation is absolutely vital for our other prophets.
It is what allows Nietzsche to boldly claim the world is an artwork. It is what allows Heidegger to say art opens a special world of being. They desperately need that distinct category of the aesthetic to exist so they can use it to replace the broken objective reality.
Right. If you want to replace a broken table with a chair, you first have to prove that chairs exist and are distinctly different from tables.
Precisely. But Derrida attacks this fundamental separation using a seemingly simple concept, the paragon, which is the Greek word for the frame.
The frame of a painting.
He looks at a painting hanging in a museum and asks a devastatingly simple question. Where exactly does the painting end and the wall begin?
It sounds like a trick question.
It is, but it reveals everything. Is the wooden frame surrounding the canvas part of the artwork itself, contributing to its aesthetic value? Or is it part of the practical, non-aesthetic architecture of the room, just a tool to hold the canvas on the wall?
Right, because if it's part of the wall, it's not art.
Derrida meticulously, painstakingly demonstrates that this boundary is entirely arbitrary. It fluctuates depending on how you look at it. And if
Hmm.
the boundary between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic is arbitrary and unstable, then the entire massive foundation of aestheticism as a reliable worldview completely collapses.
You cannot substitute art for reality if you can't even definitively prove where the art ends and reality begins.
Exactly.
It's like trying to navigate a ship using a map where the borders of the continents keep moving every time you blink. You can't rely on it.
And once he dismantles Kant's aesthetic boundaries, Derrida turns his sights on Hegel.
Now, Hegel is essentially the godfather of dialectics, the philosophical rule of three. You have a thesis, it clashes with its opposite, the antithesis, and they magically resolve into a neat higher synthesis.
This drove the idea of linear progress.
So how does Derrida dismantle that deeply ingrained desire for resolution?
He dismantles it by refusing the synthesis. Instead of a synthesis that perfectly and cleanly resolves contradictions, Derrida introduces his own concept: dissemination.
I love this word, dissemination. Imagine scattering a handful of seeds into a strong wind.
Exactly. Meaning for Derrida is never tied up in a neat bow. It is always scattering, always deferring, always slipping away from our grasp. It vehemently resists final resolution.
So you never arrive at a final answer.
Every single time you try to pin down a definitive final meaning in a text or a conversation, that meaning relies on the definition of other words, which in turn rely on other words, branching out into infinity. You can trace the dictionary all day and never reach the bottom of language.
Which leads us directly to arguably his most famous and absolutely most misunderstood catchphrase. Il n'y a pas de hors texte. Usually translated as, there's nothing outside the text.
Oh, this quote, yes.
I've heard people mock this, saying, oh, so Derrida thinks trees and cars aren't real, they're just words.
That is the most common misinterpretation. That phrase is a masterclass in his thought, but it requires nuance. He absolutely does not mean that physical trees, rocks, and cars don't physically exist.
What does he mean?
What he means is that our comprehension of reality, our entire ability to make sense of those physical objects, is entirely mediated through language, signs, cultural symbols, and context.
There's no direct access.
There is no ultimate, objective, silent standpoint outside of language from which we can judge reality. We cannot step outside of our own conceptual frameworks. Therefore, everything we experience is subject to interpretation. Everything is read and analyzed as if it were a text.
Megill's source material uses a really powerful, evocative metaphor here to illustrate the immense tension Derrida operates within. It contrasts the classic Greek paradigm with the Judeo-Christian paradigm. I want to spend a minute here because it's beautiful.
It is a stunning comparison. Megill contrasts the figure of Ulysses with the figure of Abraham.
So let's look at Ulysses first.
Think about the Greek paradigm, represented by Ulysses in the Odyssey. It is fundamentally a circular journey. Ulysses ventures out into the chaotic world. He faces terrifying monsters and trials, but ultimately, his entire purpose is to return home to Ithaca.
The journey resolves.
It is a closed, satisfying system of meaning, very much like Hegel's dialectic, where everything synthesizes in the end.
You leave home, you learn a lesson, you return home.
Yes, but the Jewish paradigm, represented by the biblical Abraham, is fundamentally different. Abraham is commanded by God to leave his homeland forever. He moves into exile, into the vast unknown, with absolutely no promise of a cyclical return.
He is perpetually wandering.
And Derrida, who himself was an Algerian-born Jew writing in France, deeply connects this Abrahamic paradigm of perpetual exile to the Kabbalistic tradition of interpreting sacred texts.
Right, because in the mystical Kabbalistic tradition, the sacred text is not read once to find a single dead literal truth.
The text is endlessly manipulated, analyzed, turned over, and generated anew by the reader. There is no single finalized truth to be found. The meaning is constantly in flux, constantly being deferred.
Derrida suggests that this endless wandering, this endless interpretation, mirrors the postmodern condition itself.
And this has massive historical stakes. We have to remember the context here. Derrida is writing in the long, dark shadow of the Holocaust.
Having survived monumental historical trauma, humanity finds survival not in desperately seeking a single, absolute, rigid truth. Because the pursuit of a single, unquestionable truth often leads directly to fascism and totalitarianism.
Exactly. Instead, survival is found in endless textual play, in living in the margins, in the continuous democratic dissemination of meaning where no single voice can claim ultimate authority.
Which brings us to Derrida's ultimate masterstroke in relation to McGill's thesis. He doesn't just deconstruct art and meaning, he completely undermines the foundational concept of the crisis itself.
If we pull all the way back and connect this to the bigger picture we started with an hour ago, the crisis that terrified Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Foucault was defined as the heartbreaking collapse of linear history.
The broken train tracks.
But Derrida reveals, through his relentless deconstruction, that linear history was always just a myth. It was never a reality. It was a textual construct created by Enlightenment thinkers to make themselves feel better.
And here is the absolute genius of his move. You cannot mourn the breaking of a line that never actually existed in the first place.
Wow. That shifts the entire paradigm.
By destroying the myth of linear history, Derrida essentially cures the angst of the crisis. There is no lost golden age to be nostalgic for, like Heidegger thought. There is no predetermined utopian future to fight for. There is just the endless, complex play of texts and interpretations.
So we have reached the end of this incredibly dense, fascinating journey. I want to ask the big question, the so what? We have journeyed through Nietzsche's frantic, active myth-making. We've sat in the woods with Heidegger's nostalgic waiting. We've marched in the streets with Foucault's relentless activism. And we've watched Derrida endlessly deconstruct the ground beneath all of their feet.
It's a lot.
If these prophets of extremity were constantly exaggerating, if their grand aesthetic theories ultimately collapse in on themselves under Derrida's scrutiny, why should you, the listener, care?
Why did we just spend an hour talking about them? Why read them at all?
That is the most important takeaway from Megill's entire analysis. We must absolutely not read these thinkers as literal step-by-step guides for how to live.
You shouldn't try to build a modern government based strictly on Foucault's theories of power.
Or try to conduct your daily relationships entirely through Nietzsche's lens of Dionysian chaos and will to power. If you do that, you will likely end up a monster.
So how do we read them?
We must read them therapeutically.
Therapeutically. Like medicine.
Yes. They are brilliant, necessary intellectual adversaries. They hold up a distorted carnival mirror to our society.
Because when you look in a carnival mirror, it doesn't show you a mathematically accurate reflection. It exaggerates your features to reveal something absurd about you.
By reading them, we are violently shaken out of our dogmatic slumbers. They force us to examine the mechanistic, thoughtless routines of our daily lives.
The great sociologist Max Weber once warned that modern bureaucratic rationalization would inevitably lead to a society composed of specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart.
We would become cogs in a machine. These four thinkers, despite all their flaws, provide the intellectual shock therapy needed to wake those spirits up.
They teach us to question the water we are swimming in. We take logic, science, and progress as self-evident truths. These prophets force us to realize they are human constructs.
And that brings us to the climax of this entire argument, and why this deep dive matters right now. Why is it so vital, especially today, that we maintain this intense skepticism?
Because the Enlightenment concept of a one true way, the deeply ingrained idea that there is a single, privileged, perfectly rational path of progress that applies universally to everyone and excludes all other perspectives, is incredibly, profoundly dangerous in the modern era.
When you combine the arrogant belief in a single absolute truth with modern technological weapons capable of total global destruction, you have a literal recipe for catastrophe.
The unshakable belief in the one true way inevitably breeds xenophobia. It justifies the oppression, the marginalization, or even the outright annihilation of the other. Anyone who does not neatly fit into that linear historical narrative.
So, to you listening, the true lasting value of these prophets of extremity isn't that they provide a perfect, flawless roadmap for reality. They don't.
Their aesthetic rebellion, despite all its blind spots, historical inaccuracies, and wild exaggerations, serves as a vital psychological and cultural defense mechanism.
It teaches us to be deeply, radically skeptical of anyone, whether it's a politician, a tech CEO, or a philosopher, claiming to hold the absolute literal truth.
It teaches us to embrace multiple conflicting perspectives. It teaches us to tolerate ambiguity without panicking. And most importantly, it teaches us to recognize that our reality is, in many ways, an ongoing, fragile, collaborative creation.
Indeed. They invite us to step outside the rigid frameworks we've passively inherited and realize the immense responsibility and the terrifying freedom that comes with interpreting our world.
We are not just passengers on a train. We are the ones laying the tracks moment by moment.
which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up.
If our modern concept of reality is just a text we've collectively written, as these thinkers suggest, what happens when artificial intelligence begins writing that text for us?
If, as Derrida says, there's nothing outside the text and our algorithms are now generating the text at scale, who or what is the author of the future?
That is the ultimate unsettling question for our time and the next frontier of the crisis. Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to stay updated on our latest episodes and never miss a step in this odyssey of thought. Until next time, keep questioning.